Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to take the concepts of productive and allocative efficiency that we learned about in the last video and apply them to monopoly and see why monopolies are so inefficient. So the first assumption we're going to make here is that the monopolist cannot price discriminate. In the next video, we'll talk about price discrimination, how that would change what we learn about here. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to compare monopoly with perfect competition in one graph. And by perfect competition, I mean the market. So we're going to compare a monopoly and a perfectly competitive market in one graph. So how do we do this? So we're going to make our graph here, and I'm going to make it pretty big so we can kind of see what's going on here. And I'm going to actually take, and this is kind of a no-no, but we're going to do it here, and take demand and marginal revenue from the y-axis. Normally we don't do that, but here it makes sense to do so, and we'll see why in a minute. Another thing that might weird you out, and I'll go ahead and say this is average revenue and price, might weird you out, is that we're actually going to make marginal cost start the y-axis and make it a, let's see if I can do that a bit better. Yeah, that'll work. We're going to make it a upward sloping line, and again, you'll see why in a minute. So the first thing we need to do is identify the monopolist profit maximizing quantity and price. So remember, that's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we come down, and we're going to call this QM for the monopoly. And remember, we have to go up to the demand curve to get the price. And then we come over, and this is going to be PM for the monopolist price. Now we're going to do the same thing for the perfectly competitive market. And you may be like, well, gosh, where would that be? Well, remember, the perfectly competitive market, the quantity is where supply intersects demand. We have a demand curve. Well, where's supply? Well, remember, in one of the videos on perfect competition, we talked about how marginal cost effectively is the supply curve. So where do those two intersect? We're going to use red here for perfect competition, right there, and then we're going to come down to get the quantity. Again, this is for the market, not the firm. We'll call it quantity C for a competitive market. And then we're going to bring it over. We don't have to go to a demand curve. We're already at the demand curve. And we'll call it PC for the price in the perfectly competitive market. Again, we're comparing the monopoly with the market. Okay? So the next thing we want to do here is just make a little comparison. So what we can see here is that the perfectly competitive market charges a lower price than monopoly and sells more output than monopoly. So again, you can see why economists prefer competition to monopoly, because you get higher output and lower prices. You can also see that monopolies are not allocatively efficient. Why? Because their price does not equal their marginal cost, right? So their price is actually above marginal cost. Their marginal cost would be below the price. So I can kind of take that out here. So I'll make this little dot, but it's right here where this dot's getting bigger. They're not allocatively efficient. They are also not productively efficient either. I mean, because most monopolies are not going to produce at minimum ATC because they can make a profit because they're a price maker. So we don't have average total cost on here. But what we can see is that, generally speaking, perfectly competitive firms are productively efficient in markets. Monopolies are not productively efficient either. And finally, we can actually identify the deadweight loss, because remember, if monopolies aren't allocatively efficient, there must be deadweight loss. Remember, deadweight loss always points to where society wants to be, and that's at equilibrium. So there is the deadweight loss right there. Okay. So we can see just how inefficient monopolies are. Not only do they charge consumers a higher price, they make less output, they're not allocatively efficient, they're probably not productively efficient, they're just not very good compared to, perfect competition. And you may wonder, well, then why do they exist? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some are the government creates them. Remember, we talked about market power, so patents, that kind of thing. Some of them kind of have to exist because of high fixed costs, so natural monopolies. And some just exist because, there's political forces at play that kind of allow them to do so. So what I want to do now, and you may want to pause the video and write all this down and then come back and listen to me talk about it, but I wanted to just, now that we've really gone through perfect competition and monopoly, to compare them. And again, this is non-price discriminating monopolies. So let's go through each one of these. So we know in perfect competition there's identical products. In monopolies, it's a unique product. In perfect competition, there's many firms. In monopolies, there is one firm. In perfect competition, they are price takers. In monopoly, they are price makers, meaning they can set their own price. As we saw on the graph, they charge a lower price in perfect comp, whereas in monopoly, they charge a higher price. And as we saw before, they produce more output, but monopolies produce less output. Perfectly competitive firms have no long-run profit, but in monopolies they can. Why? Because of barriers to entry. Perfectly competitive firms have low barriers to entry, which means firms can come in and gobble up those profits, whereas in monopolies there's high barriers to entry, and so firms cannot come in and get that profit. Perfectly competitive firms are allocatively efficient always. Monopolies are not allocatively efficient unless the government comes in and forces them to be, and we'll see that in a later video. In perfect competition, they are productively efficient always in the long run, sometimes in the short run. Monopolies are not productively efficient typically because they tend to not produce at minimum ATC because it's easy for them to make a profit because they can charge whatever price they want. In perfect competition, there is more consumer surplus because the price is lower, but in monopolies, there's less consumer surplus because the price is higher. And the opposite is true with producer surplus. There's less producer surplus in perfect competition, but more so in monopolies because the price in monopoly is higher. And finally, as we saw on the graph, there's no deadweight loss in perfect competition, but there is deadweight loss in monopolies because a monopoly is not allocatively efficient. They do not set price equal to marginal cost. So it's very, very important we understand these, I think there's 12 of them, differences between perfect competition and monopoly. Because AP is fond of asking you to see if you know the differences between the market structures. Right now we only know two. We're getting close to adding a third one. But just understanding these differences and sitting down with them and really thinking about them is going to be important moving forward. So that's all for this video on the inefficient monopolist. Until next time, have a great day.